Hello, my name is Krasta. I'm now honored to talk on television with Professor Jordan Peterson. Professor, thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here.
I've learned to pay attention to your publications, books, your way of communicating, your television presences, because of my son, who is a avid fan of yours. Let us talk about 12 rules of life, translated by our very own Atena Bishka, will be finally read by the Albanian readers. I was just curious, what is your feeling with a book of yours, months or even years after the first publications?
Well, I'm pleased that it's getting an international audience. It's been translated into, I think it's 53 languages now. So that covers all the major language groups where there's a reasonable population of readers across the world. So that's really exciting. The fact that it's had some influence and impact across cultures is reassuring to me, because it does concentrate on, let's say, moral issues or issues of value. And the fact that that seems to translate across national borders, let's say, is positive in my view. Surprising, but positive. And then I'm also, of course, extremely, what would you say, grateful, that's the right word, and pleased that the book 12 Rules is still selling extraordinarily well 3 years after its publication, which I tried to make it not bound to the present moment. And it's not a political book, although you wouldn't know that from the scandal that surrounds me. I tried to make it a book that wouldn't be bound by time particularly, and perhaps that was successful. At least the continued marketability of the book seems to indicate that it was. So I'm very happy about all that.
Let us talk about some issues that are very important to all of us. For me personally, it's important to say the truth, for example. Yet often, and when it counts the most, it takes bravery character to say what you believe is true. What is your approach to truth, even though I know that you are very direct?
Well, in the next book I wrote, it's called Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life. I have a chapter 3, which is entitled Do Not Hide Things in the Fog. And it pertains to, it's a extension of a chapter in the first book, which was do not lie, or tell the truth, or at least do not lie. It's hard to tell the truth, but you can tell when you're lying, and you cannot do that. One form of lie, which is more subtle, is to be silent when you have something to say. When your conscience is demanding of you to state something, it's often a consequence of conflict. And the reason that people don't speak up is because they don't want to engage in the conflict, even though they may know that it's necessary and they may pay a big price for it. So there's a kind of lie that's a sin of omission rather than a sin of commission. And that's the lie of not investigating something when you know that there's something rotten in the state of Denmark, for example, and that you could discover it if you delved into it, or to remain silent when you have something to say. Those are more subtle forms of deception, but assuming that your vision and your ability to speak, your ability to pay attention and your ability to speak is worth something, then you deprive yourself of your highest attribute, and you deprive others of that highest attribute too, when your conscience is requiring you to attend and to speak and you refuse. And I think the consequences of that for you are likely to be quite dire as time progresses too, because you're storing up trouble for the future.
But today it's important to tell the truth or to relate to facts because of everything that happens. Is it a lost battle, do you think?
I don't think it's ever a lost battle, but I think it's always a battle. People have the capacity for deception and for self-deception, and we struggle all the time within the confines of our own souls and in our social institutions as well with expediency, say, versus truth, or expediency versus meaning. I believe that the truth prevails in the end in some sense, because the truth is related to reality and there's no circumventing or skirting reality. Maybe you can do it for a short period of time, and if you're narcissistic and entitled, then maybe you believe that you can get away with it. But one of the things that I've insisted upon in my books is that, well, for example, as a clinician, I've never seen anyone get away with anything. I mean, I've dealt with many people who had all sorts of problems, and you can trace the genesis of the problem when it's not due to simple bad luck or catastrophe, because that often obviously happens. You can trace the catastrophe back to something that wasn't attended to properly, or some act of deception that was undertaken, or some act of self-deception. It's a very bad idea. But you know, our sense of freedom, our freedom perhaps itself, is dependent or is intrinsically associated with our ability to generate falsehoods and to avoid the truth. And we can't have one without the other. But it's not a good idea to have reality arrayed against you. And that is what happens when you start to act in a deceptive manner. That can pervert and destroy whole societies, and has done that, I mean, many, many times in the past, and most evidently, obviously, recently in the 20th century, where whole societies were corrupted by not only sins of omission, but also sins of commission, by lies and avoidance. So we don't want to walk down that path again. And we have so much technological power now that we don't have the luxury of, we don't have the same luxury of immorality that we had in the past, assuming we ever had it.
Professor, many of us believe, or are consistently being taught, that our goal in life should be pursuing happiness, which I myself think is right. But you say the opposite. Your advice is say no to happiness. Why is that?
No, I wouldn't say that. I say that it's not a good pursuit. It's not
okay.
an end. It's a consequence of if you're fortunate, it's a consequence of an honest and meaningful form of existence. And it's not something, it doesn't make a good pursuit. Meaning makes a better pursuit. Responsibility makes a better pursuit. And if you're fortunate and your pursuits are ethical and of high quality and generous, then if you're fortunate, happiness will visit you, and then you should be grateful that it is. But it's a measure rather than an aim, as far as I can tell. And so, and happiness is also, even if you look at it technically, the other thing I should point out is psychologists have studied what people want when they say they want to be happy. And actually what they're after isn't happiness. It's more like absence of negative emotion. And so the negative emotion and the positive emotion systems are separate. And negative emotions include fear and pain and shame and guilt and disappointment and frustration and rage. And those are all aversive and unpleasant. And when people say they want to be happy, really what they mean, if you assess the full panoply of their desires, is that they wish to be relatively free of negative emotion. Now, if they can get some genuine joy on top of that, that's a bonus for sure. But it's more absence of suffering. And I do believe that the most appropriate pathway to absence of suffering is something like responsibility and truth. There's more to it than that. Responsibility, truth, and meaning, intrinsic meaning, something like that. And that's deeper too. And people know in some sense that the pursuit of mere happiness is shallow. It doesn't have a compelling depth to it. So, and that's an indication that it's insufficient in my estimation. But you should be grateful if it happens. That's for sure.
What we see today, it's the people are tired of politics, a general feeling of apathy. How do you talk about meaning or meaningful things to people who are disappointed, disillusioned, to those who have lost trust in politics or have little to no hope for the future? How do we talk to them and with them?
Well, one of the things I've tried to detail is the idea that trust is actually a form of courage. And I would say the same about love. And you might say, well, should you be positively oriented towards social institutions, educational institutions, the church, and so forth, political structures? Should you be positively oriented towards corporate structures? And you might respond with a certain degree of perhaps well-earned cynicism, because all of those institutions have their elements of corruption. But it does seem to me that it's appropriate to aim your life in the direction of wanting the best for those institutions and trying to improve them. And that's an article of faith, right? That it would be better to work to make things better. That's an element of faith. And then another element of faith, I suppose, is that truth is a good way of serving that end. And then, so I would say to people who are cynical is, look, first you're naive, and then when you get hurt by other people, by yourself, by society, by nature for that matter, by God, then you get cynical, and maybe being cynical is an improvement over being naive. But courageous is not, courageous is an improvement over cynical. And so when you get past cynicism, you decide to trust, you decide to generate a positive vision of the future, because that's the best way of bringing it into being. And you do that despite knowledge of corruption, and despite knowledge that things, including yourself, go sideways. And so it's a call to courage. And that means you can keep your wisdom, your hard-earned wisdom about the inadequacies of the world, but still move forward in a positive direction. And that's a good thing, because then you don't undermine your own motivations, for example, right? And you don't want to do that, because doubt can overcome you, and that's not a good thing for anyone.
Well, you have once mentioned that freedom of speech sits at the top of the hierarchy of values. I know, but our viewers have to know, what is it so important? What is the relationship of the modern society with the freedom of speech today?
Well, again, you could look at this technically. So a lot of what we do when we think is to think in words. And so if maybe you posit a question to yourself, you're curious about something, and something within you generates answers. There's a revelatory element to thought, and maybe it generates verbal answers, but it does it using speech. Our brains think with speech. We think in images as well, but we think in speech. And then if you're thinking still without dialogue, you're thinking after something's been revealed to you, you might generate a counter argument and a little personality in some sense that goes along with that, and then a personality that stands for the first idea. And then inside your mind, you have a dialogue, an argumentative dialogue or a cooperative dialogue between these two different stances. And then you derive a conclusion, and then you act it out. And so you test the conclusion before you act it out in the world, so that if it's a stupid conclusion, you don't bother punishing yourself too dreadfully by enacting it. But all that's the internalization of what's really primarily a social process. Most of the way that we think, and certainly most of the way that we keep ourselves organized psychologically, is a consequence of dialogue. It's thought in free speech. If there's no free speech, there's no thought. And so if you think thought is worthwhile, if you think something through, you're less likely to suffer dreadfully from your stupidity, then you have to allow for free thought, because there's no distinction between free speech. I mean, there's no distinction between free speech and free thought. And there's no distinction between free thought and thought. You don't have to think about things that no one disagrees about, because if there's consensus generated around something, we probably know the answer to it. If there's conflict around something, and so it's a contentious issue, that's precisely an indication that that's a place that we have to think. And so that's a place that we have to be able to speak. And if we can't speak our minds, well, we can't think. And so if you make an argument against free speech, you should ban it if it's offensive, for example. Well, then you have to make an argument against thought itself. And I would say the assaults on free speech are predicated on the idea that in some sense, individual thought is an illusion, but that we're only mouthpieces of our group identity, for example. That's a common modern, postmodern, let's say, proposition, which I believe to be not only absurd but reprehensible as well as absurd. So,
well, let me tell you a concern of mine personally. But I decide to talk freely. I decide to talk openly, to lose on purpose that political correctness. This may generate reaction, bad reaction. It seems like I have to like my being different in a masochistic way somehow. So how do I see my courage to speak the truth and everything that comes with it in today's world?
Well, look, there's no doubt that there is a price to speaking often. And there's evidence of that everywhere. I mean, I've watched many, many people be mobbed, let's say, on Twitter, for example. And so maybe they'll say something and 20 people are outraged by it. And people tend to respond to that psychologically as if a mob of their neighbors, 20 of their neighbors showed up on their doorstep with pitchforks and and torches. And I can understand that, because we should note the impact of our actions on others if we're socialized properly. And so it's good people who feel guilty when a sequence of individuals objects to something that they say. And people pay a real price for that psychologically. It's devastating, and people will generally apologize and backpedal like mad. But the problem with that is that if the truth has become offensive, then that means that we're forfeiting our ability to adapt to reality, because the truth is reflective of reality. And if you forbid reality, well, obviously there's going to be a consequence to that. Now, you might say, I'm going to keep my mouth shut because it's safer, and fair enough, but is it safer? That's the real question. And I would say, no, it's safer in the very short term, but it produces catastrophic consequences in the medium to long term, both psychologically and socially. I mean, we've seen what's happened over and over, especially in the 20th century, when entire societies become consumed by a shared lie. Everyone knows they're lying. You know, I believe it was in East Germany in the Soviet era, where 1/3 of the population served as government informers, and no one could ever say what they thought, ever. And so how can you live like that? And much less live, how can you possibly think and be productive? And then you can't trust anyone. And then you can't even trust yourself, because you can't let yourself think. You know, I interviewed a woman from North Korea a while back, because she'd escaped from North Korea, and she told me that her mother told her that she shouldn't even talk out in the forest, because the birds and the butterflies would hear. And so to forbid what you think, and to forbid the right to express that in speech, is to forbid yourself to exist and to grow. And that's a huge price. You know, let's say your workplace is becoming politically toxic, and you don't object, and it becomes increasingly politically toxic. And the consequence of that is that not only do you want to go to work less and less, you find it punitive, and then whatever positive outcome your work might have been producing is going to be destroyed and undermined. And then, while you have no pleasure left in your life under those circumstances, you've become a slave one step at a time. And you won't be braver once you're completely a slave. You won't be. Because by that time you'll have given in 100 times, and so your enemies will be 100 times stronger, and you'll be 100 times weaker. That's a bad developmental trajectory.
Let us talk a little bit about the so-called Swiss Army knife of today's political warfare, the cancel culture. Andrew Sullivan once said that we live now, all of us, on campus. What is going on? I mean,
right.
In your view, how does cancel culture impact freedom of speech?
Well, the first part of that is that we all live on campus. That's a very interesting statement, but I would say that's reflective of the fact that ideas are extraordinarily powerful. I think it was Nietzsche who said that we're all unconscious exponents of dead philosophers. You know, everything that we think and say was generated in the main by some great thinker who we're unconsciously imitating or implicitly imitating. There are wars between ideas, let's say, going on in the university campuses, and you think, well, that's all abstract and irrelevant to day-to-day practical concerns, but that's not true at all. Ideas are extraordinarily powerful, and you can easily get caught up in their sway. And all of the postmodern ideas that I've been objecting to, which are an odd offshoot of Marxism, or a camouflaged form of Marxism, at least in part, switching in power for economics, they've been formulated and disseminated primarily within the universities, and then they've moved out into the broader culture, into schools and into corporations, especially in human resources departments. And so, yes, and we're not, by no means are we done with that. And so we think these things are pure abstractions, but they're not. They're genuine realities. They're ideas first, and then they're acted out in the world. So, and if we start assuming that the group is the canonical marker of identity, then, well, we're going to find out exactly what the consequence of that is. It's going to be, at minimum, a relapse into a kind of vicious tribalism. And I don't think we want that, or we wouldn't if we were wise.
Let us talk
You know,
now.
it's hard to tell
Yeah.
what people want. I put this clip up a while back, which is a reaction to the Communist Manifesto, a critique of the Communist Manifesto, and something extremely revealing happened when I was it was part of a debate, and I was producing this critique sort of in real time, and I talked about the Communist Manifesto as a call to violent, bloody revolution, and about a quarter of the audience started to laugh and cheer, and it really threw me off. I paused for about 10 seconds because I couldn't believe that had happened, but it was a Freudian slip in the truest sense. You know, the audience was full of people whose identities were masked by the crowd, and so they could allow their genuine motivations full sway. And so when I talked about bloody, violent revolution, and that produced the clapping and the cheering, you know, the motives for the underlying philosophy, the destruction of the individual, the critique of meritocracy, the insistence that everything's about power and that it's one group against the other, the true motivations for that came forth in that laughter and cheering. And maybe that was the underground hope for bloody, violent revolution and death, you know, as a consequence of resentment and spite. And those are very powerful motivations, resentment in particular. It's a very, very, very toxic emotion. And when it finds its expression in the political realm, that's extraordinarily dangerous. And
Well,
that is happening.
Well, if free media and professional journalism risk becoming corrupt under the real threats of censorship, or auto-censorship for that matter, which is happening right now in my country, then what are the alternatives? Where would the public look for objective facts and truth?
Well, one of the things that is perhaps positive about today is that there's a tremendous range of expression of ideas on social media and YouTube and podcasts and so forth. And so every individual now has the capability of being their own television station and their own radio station, their own publishing house. Each individual has the capacity to communicate their ideas to a much broader audience than was ever possible in the past. And so that's all being offered to people, and perhaps something good will come out of that. I mean, increasingly, people, especially younger people, are turning to alternative media sources to inform them about the world. And that's going to continue to happen, because if for no other reason than the technology is so overwhelmingly powerful. And, you know, I've noticed too, although this interview is being conducted in a very conversational manner, and it's fairly spontaneous and genuine, often in legacy media interviews, they're highly, highly scripted. And in some sense, the person doing the interview is a puppet of the organization that's broadcasting the interview. There's nothing genuine about the interaction. It's really false and forced, and that doesn't happen in these new media forms because there's no bandwidth limitation. So maybe, you know, maybe that's I think that's a good thing. I think it's equivalent to the development of the printing press in terms of its overall technological impact. Problem is, people have to decide for themselves, you know, and that we don't know what the consequence of that will be.
In the Rule 11 of your book, 12 Rules for Life, you talk about how important it is for men to toughen up. Well, Professor, let us imagine a little boy, sweet and well-mannered, doesn't play tough, super agreeable. In your view, could a boy like this end up becoming an autocratic, calculative, manipulating, ruthless man? How? What happens? Why?
Well, I think people become ruthless, and because they become bitter, and they become bitter because, I mean, the personality type that you just outlined is likely less likely to become autocratic and more likely to become depressed and anxious, being overly agreeable and maybe sensitive. That would be a more likely developmental trajectory for pathology. It's more disagreeable types that are more likely to become autocratic, especially if they're also extremely conscientious, say, and low in openness. But people become malevolent often because of bitterness, you know, when they get hurt by life. I kind of outline a theory of pain, I suppose, and suffering in chapter 11 of my new book, which will be translated into Albanian in the near future. You know, we get hurt by nature because we're vulnerable, biologically speaking, and We get hurt by culture because we're forced into a mold that might not be exactly the right size for us. And we're hurt by ourselves because we betray ourselves. And all of those sources of hurt have the capacity to corrupt us ethically and to make us bitter, and then to make us wish to work to produce more pain and more suffering, often out of revenge. And that, I think that can happen to anyone. I think it's more likely to happen if people engage habitually in deceit, and perhaps if they don't have good guidance, because it's hard to find your way alone in the world. We're highly social creatures, and we need good models. I mean, it's 18 years before we're basically adult. We really need good models. And so the lack of all that, I mean, you see this in part in the literature on fatherlessness. So, it's much boys in particular from single mother families, especially single mother families where the mother is economically disadvantaged and maybe struggling in a variety of other ways. They're much more likely to grow up aggressive, for example, and to engage in criminal activity and so forth. How that manifests itself politically isn't clear from the literature, but part of that's a consequence of lack of guidance. You need to take your implicit impulses towards aggression, for example, which is a short-term adaptive strategy, and have a substitute made for that that's more sophisticated, and that needs to be done through modeling, at least in part. Modeling and encouragement and discipline, all of those things that a good mentor or good guide could offer. That's really the role of fathers. It's the role of social institutions when they're functioning properly.
You are particularly drawn to the ideas of evil and good, especially in the context of totalitarian regimes, Gulag Archipelago in Soviet Union, Maoist China. Albania, as you know, has suffered under the Enver's totalitarian regime for about half a century. Now,
yes,
in my country, it's no secret there are people who regard at least some aspects of our communist past, if not all of it, as positive and useful. How do you explain this nostalgia about old communist regimes in the Eastern European countries?
Well, when the transition was made from the communist regime to the post-communist regime, many people suffered terribly, especially people who had already staked their lives in some sense on the pre-existing structure. And so I would say that would be everyone, pretty much everyone over 40, because by that time your identity is pretty well catalyzed and what you've learned how to operate within the system that already existed. And so that's swept away, and perhaps that opens the door for young people to come up and operate and live in a different direction. But it's pretty hard on people who were dependent entirely on everything they learned about a structure that no longer existed. So there's that. That's a genuine loss, and it's also the case that just because things were bad doesn't mean they couldn't get worse. And it was certainly the case after the Soviet Union collapsed that the 90s were no picnic for the people in post-Soviet countries. And some of them were in much more dire straits than others. But it's not. Look, here's an example. In the book of Exodus, Moses leads his people out of slavery, and Egypt is a tyranny, and the Pharaoh is an authoritarian dictatorship. And Moses is motivated by God, and he's a great prophet. But what happens? Well, the Israelites spend 40 years in the desert. It's like they go from tyranny to hell before they get to the promised land. And that's an archetypal story for a reason. It's when a structure breaks apart, no matter how maladaptive it is, it degenerates into chaos. It doesn't move from tyranny to the promised land with no intervening catastrophe. And this is also why we were talking earlier about people staying silent when they have something to say. It's like, well, maybe the system is corrupt and you need to object to it. But when you object to it and you disrupt the structure, which might be your place in the structure, let's say, there might be an intervening period of utter chaos before things improve. And people look at that intervening period and they say, oh my God, I don't want that. And no wonder. And then you might say, well, the only way to the promised land is through the desert or across the river, right? Or across the sea, which was the case again in the Exodus story for the same reason. Well, do you want to go into the chaos before you go up? And the answer often is no. But then you stay in the tyranny and it gets worse and worse. And then there's the tendency too of people to preferentially remember positive things about the past, and so they remember the good times of their youth, let's say, and and they forget the bad times, and that plays a role as well.
When talking about the countries of post-communist countries and talk about the youth in these countries, how should young people build a future without losing sight of the rear view window of the past and crimes committed under the communist regime? Should they know? Should they know what? Should they learn what? How?
Well, I've thought about that a lot, and I think I would answer that from the perspective of a behavioral psychologist. Like, if I'm dealing with someone who's confused about what to do and whose idea about the future is chaotic, I ask them very practical questions. It's like, well, do you have an intimate relationship? Do you have a girlfriend or a boyfriend? And if the answer is no, it's like, well, there's a place to start. And, well, are you as educated as you are intelligent? And if the answer is no, well, then you should pick something and learn about it. And if you don't know what to pick, then pick something. Because at least when you go learn that, and it's not the right thing, you'll learn exactly why, and maybe you'll choose the right thing. And you need a job or a career if you're fortunate, but at least a job. You need friends, you need family. So if your family ties are all destroyed, well, then you could work on generating them, or maybe generating friendships that could conceivably replace them. And you have to take care of your mental and physical health, and you have to develop a philosophical or a spiritual outlook, and you have to regulate your interactions with temptation, alcohol, drug abuse, pornography, all of that. And so I would say you decompose the idea of what you should pursue into these sub-aspects. It's a kind of a conservative approach, because I would suggest to people who are confused that they do what everyone else does and see how that works. And then maybe you judge your success across these multiple dimensions. And if you're still unhappy, well, then you have to look deeper. But that's a really good place to start. And there's no reason to be cynical about that if you're young. It's a big mistake to be cynical, because generally speaking, your best bet is trusting, hard work, and productivity, and generosity. All of those things, they're your best bet. Now, you might be somewhere that's so corrupt and so dismal that none of that works. And, well, that's a catastrophe. But generally, I've never met anyone in my clinical practice, and certainly never counseled anyone as a student, who couldn't decompose their life in that manner and find ways that they could progress. And generally, they also knew, well, I've been avoiding putting a dating profile online. I know I spend too much time with pornography. I know I drink too much. I know I waste, 6 or 7 hours a day. So it's a conservative approach. I mean, politically in some sense. So if you don't know what to do, look at what everybody does and try to do that. And then if that isn't good enough for you, well, maybe you're a creative person, an entrepreneurial type, and you need to do something new and different. And that's possible, and that's a high risk, high return pathway, but it might be necessary. And so you could add that if you happen to have that kind of temperament. But you can solve all those problems at a relatively micro level. And instead of, torturing yourself about the vaguely defined bigger picture. And there's no reason for young people to be apocalyptically doubtful about the future. By any reasonable standard, everything is better now than it's ever been, especially if you look at it globally. I know we hear about climate catastrophe and that sort of thing, but the apocalypse is always around the corner. That's always been the case. And you have to live in the face of that. And there's no more evidence, as far as I'm concerned, that the apocalypse is nigh than there was when I was 18, when we were concerned about the threat of nuclear destruction and premature glaciation at that time and acid rain, and the probability that by the year 2000, we were going to be overpopulated to the point where there'd be starvation everywhere. We're going to run out of water. No. That didn't happen.
We've come at my last question, and I've chosen this as a ordinary viewer. I've seen, and I've valued very much, I liked it very much, your conceptual debate with Zizek, which was televised. And it reminded me, as a matter of fact, in form, It reminded me of the debates between Gore Vidal and William Buckley Jr. In the 60s. How did you feel? I mean, how was it debating with someone as Zizek, having different viewpoints, going along the cliff of debating ideas? How did you feel? Was it interesting? Why?
Well, it was definitely interesting. I mean, and I liked the time that I spent with Zizek. And I should also say that when I was ill over the last 2 years, he contacted me several times to wish me well. And so we got along quite well personally, and I found him quite charming. The debate, in some sense, was frustrating to me because it didn't end up being about what I presumed it would be about. And my interpretation, in part, was that Zizek didn't really want to defend the Marxist presuppositions that I was hell-bent on dismantling. And so, you know, I opened the debate with about a 15-minute critique of the Communist Manifesto, and Zizek indicated quite quickly that there were many elements of that critique that he agreed about, and he defined himself as a Hegelian, and that meant that it was difficult to continue with the debate about Marxism per se. And so that was somewhat frustrating. I'm hoping that I get another chance to talk to him. And, you know, it's not as if I think that there's any lack of validity to political ideas that are concerned with inequality of distribution. I mean, I understand that there's a problem of absolute poverty, and I do believe that that's best addressed by a capitalist free market society. I think all the evidence points in that direction, but that doesn't remove the fact that there's still dramatic inequalities in the distribution of, well, in the distribution of everything. And to some degree, that's unavoidable, but it's necessary for societies to ameliorate the worst consequences of that. And I think when the left wing is operating properly, you know, they are the proper political voice for the unjustly dispossessed. Now, the left goes too far, in my estimation, when they do blanket critiques and call for the revolutionary overthrow of everything, you know, predicated on the idea that some utopian future will be called into being as a consequence of the application of a simple-minded ideology. It's like, no, and that just, if you're a utopian, you can justify every evil act you undertake in the present by referring to the, you know, heavenly future that your actions are going to bring about, and that's a terrible moral hazard. And, you know, I think the evidence, there's no evidence that communist systems do anything but tremendous damage. And it's stunning to me in some sense that we still have to have that discussion. Now, having said that, I do still understand that inequality of distribution is, you know, remains a problem. So, well, back to civilized political discourse. You know, there's a room for careful voices on the right, and there's room for careful voices on the left, and they're both necessary, and the dialogue is of paramount importance.
Well, Professor Jordan Peterson, thank you very much for being with us. It was an immense pleasure. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And it's such a pleasure to be able to talk to everybody in Albania. It's such a privilege to be able to do that. And say hello to your son for me.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right. All right. Thank you very much. And bye-bye.